Welcome back, you guys. If you guys remember, last week we talked about, or 2 weeks ago, sorry, we talked about creating a drop-down combo box that was populated dynamically from a table on our worksheet. So instead of having to code in manually what the options were from a drop-down, it can read from a list, a table, and then populate that dynamically so you can expand and contract that drop-down list. So if that's something you're interested in, go back, watch that video. If not, let's continue on. Today we're going to be talking about saving our UserForm data into a raw sheet to where then we can, apply analytics, we can do pivot tables, we can do whatever we want. So we're going to take our UserForm data and save the values of it into an actual sheet on the workbook. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create another worksheet to where that data is going to be saved. Okay, so we're going to create a raw data sheet here, and I've already done this. We just call it raw data. And then in the first column here, we're going to call this winery because that's one of the fields that we want to save. And then we're going to call the next one order number. Okay, so we'll expand these columns just a little bit. We'll bold them a little bit just to give them a little pizzazz. So now we're going to take the UserForm data and we're going to save it into these two columns that we have here. So every time that new data is entered into the UserForm, it's going to append new rows, right? Because we don't want it to override existing data or skip rows or whatever. Anytime new data is added, it's going to add it to the next row. Okay, so let's go back to our UserForm, and the first thing we need to do is add a new module. So we're going to right click in the pane over here. We're going to say Insert Module, and we're going to call this sub Save User Data. Awesome. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create variables for the sheet that we're going to be saving it to. Because if you saw here, we have multiple sheets. We have sheet 1, we have raw data, we have reference table. We need to tell the UserForm, hey, we need to save the user's data into this raw data tab. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to create variables for that. So the first variable we need to create is for our actual workbook. So we're going to say dim this workbook as workbook. So this is this workbook that we're working on. And then we're going to say dim raw sheet as worksheet. And we're going to set both of these variables. So we're going to say set this workbook equals workbooks application dot this workbook dot name. Okay, so this workbook, this WB is set to this specific workbook. Now we need to set the raw sheet. So we're going to say set raw sheet equal to this workbook dot worksheets, and it's called raw data. So now we can reference this variable whenever we want to save or read or do anything with the raw data sheet. All we need to do is reference this variable. Perfect. So the first thing we need to do is figure out the last row. Sorry, not the first thing we need to do. The next thing we need to do is figure out the last row of data that we have. Because when we save data, like I said, we don't want to overwrite any existing data. So we want to get the last record of our raw data sheet. Cool. So we're going to say last row equals our sheet, raw sheet dot cells, raw sheet dot rows dot counts, and we're going to count column A. Okay, and we're going to go end Excel up dot row. So this is going to get our, in column A, it's going to get the last row used that is currently populated. Okay, so we actually need to increment this by 1 because we don't want to update that last record there. So we'll do that here in a second. So now what we need to do is go back to our UserForm. We have winery underscore form here. Our combo box is called winery underscore combo, and our order number is called order number underscore text. So we want to get the values from these two things and save them to our UserForm, correct? So we're going to go back to our module, and we're going to say raw sheet dot range A and last row plus 1 dot value, right? Because raw sheet being the sheet that we want to save it to, the range in column A, we want to get the last row plus 1 because we don't want to override anything, dot value equals the winery underscore form dot our winery combo, so winery combo dot value. Perfect. So this is going to save our winery value into the next row in the column. Now we're going to save our order number. So we're going to do the same thing, raw sheet dot range, column B, and last row plus 1 dot value equals winery form dot order number dot text. So this is going to get our winery combo, and then it's going to get our order number and save it to the raw sheet tab. So if we go back to the winery form, what I forgot to add here is we need a way to call this function, this thing that we just created, this module. We need a way to say, hey, do this action. So if we go back into our winery form, we're going to add a button here. Okay, so if we select this little toggle up here, it looks like a little toolbox. We select toolbox, and there is a command button. And we're just going to place that command button down here somewhere. We'll give it a nice name, the caption being, we'll say save input. Okay, and we'll give it a name of save user input underscore button. Awesome. So now, if you guys remember, from the previous video, we talked about the code behind. So if we double click on anything inside of our actual form here, it's going to pop up a dialog, or another window rather, of code that's actually behind the user form. So if we double click winery here, you'll see our initialize private sub that we created earlier, which populates our winery combo box. So now what we need to do is we need to create code behind for the save input button. And the save input button is simply just going to call the sub that we just created to save that input. So if we go back to the module, the sub that we just created, and we called it save user data, we're going to copy this. Awesome. We're going to go back to our user form, and we're going to double click on our button. So when we double click on it, it'll create this private sub automatically and say save user input button. On the click, we want to call this function, the one that we had just created. So our module 1, save user data, we go back to our form, and we double click our button. You'll see that it's saying, okay, just call this thing, and it's going to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and see how this looks. So we have our our worksheet here, our raw data sheet. So when we save user input, if we did this correctly, it should save it into this row here. And then when we save our next one, it'll save it to this row, then this row, then this row, and it'll just keep appending on until we're done. So let's go to our form, let's go back to our sheet 1 where we have this button that will display our user form. We'll click it. Let's say Zach's Winery, our order number is 121, and now we have the save button, and we will click, and hopefully it happened. We'll go to our raw data sheet, and bam, you can see Zach's Winery, order number 121. So now let's go do this again. Let's go Aiden's Winery, order number 191. We'll save the input. We'll exit out of this. We'll go look at the raw data, and bam. So you can see that it's just going to keep appending and appending and appending, which is really good for future analytics. You can see history. You can see all sorts of things. So now we know exactly, where the data is going, what the data is which data is being populated here. The nice thing about these user forms is that you can't just enter anything into these cells. If you're really interested in keeping good analytics, you don't want people just manually typing anything in. So here, for example, if we type in Aiden's Winery, and we do some kind of analytics on this, these two things are going to look completely different, where they're actually the same, but this one is just missing an apostrophe. So if you go to create like a pivot table, for example, it will see those two things as two different items because they're just not the same. So that's the power of a user form. It controls the user input, so you can have really good, accurate data to do analysis on. So one thing too that I want to mention, if we go back into our user form, when the user saves the data, we're going to dismiss the user form. Right? So after they're done saving it, we want to dismiss the user form completely. We don't want them to see anything at all. So if we go back into our Save Input button, we double click it here. So after Save User Input is called, what we want to do is we want to unload me, which means the user form that we're currently in, me is whatever we're currently in. We want to unload it, which is just exit out of it for us. So if we go back and do this again, we click on our thing, we select Tiffany's Winery, order number is 155, and we say Save User Input, you'll see that the user form goes away immediately, which is what we want. And now if we go back to here, you'll see that Tiffany's Winery was added to the new row. So, perfect. That is all I wanted to cover on this video, you guys, saving user input from the user form to a raw data sheet to where then later on you can do analytics, you can create pivot tables, dashboards, reports, whatever you want to. If this was helpful, you guys, please don't forget to like and subscribe. You guys can also check out my TikTok, The Excel Guy, where I do basic Excel formulas. That's it for today's episode. Next week we're getting into something really fun, so please come back, and I'll see you guys then. Thank you. Bye.